What is the difference between sympathy and compassion?
That's unexpected. I must say, you fight well. Now put that in your pipe and smoke it.
I was going to do a podcast on this one. I've been wanting to do this for a while. This is one of the, I think, biggest misconceptions out there. What if there's a different? People like to throw the term compassion or the word compassion about, and I don't think people understand the difference between compassion and sympathy, and empathy for that matter. Let me start with empathy. Empathy, and I've talked about this before. I've talked about empathy is when an individual actually, feels what another person's feeling. I did a video on that, and so I'm gonna set that aside. So if you guys are asking me about empathy after this, there's a video I did about doing readings from a place of empathy and the challenges that come with that. I actually asked the tarot to show me in an illustration what was the difference between sympathy and compassion. And it's just kind of interesting what came up. Compassion came up as the world beyond. Now in this particular deck, I don't know, for those of you who know the tarot, this particular deck has three worlds in it. The spirit world, the physical world, and then the world beyond. So this one is the world beyond. So compassion is something that traditionally was associated with beings that were more enlightened, that actually could see the bigger picture and help an individual through compassion reach a stage of enlightenment by whatever means necessary, using whatever tools needed to be used. And sometimes they could be very tricky. And some of the old stories of Buddhas and compassion were very interesting. For those of you who read the story of Marpa was actually a Banku, and some of the things that Marpa did seemed at first cruel. And Marpa's wife was always trying to intervene and get in between Marpa and Milarepa, but Marpa knew what he was doing. He was actually moving Milarepa towards enlightenment. For those of you who've read that story, read the story. It's a beautiful story. It's been manipulated somewhat, but the older the version, the better. So compassion is whatever needs to be done, and I'm gonna give an example here in a minute. And then sympathy. Well, I think when the star comes up, a lot of times it indicates attention or a need for attention, or getting attention, or wanting attention. So I think it's the compassion and sympathy. The difference between compassion is, let's for a working definition say, compassion has a sort of otherworldly or world beyond quality that sees the bigger picture and sees an individual and what they really need. And sympathy is something that gives a person attention. It doesn't necessarily do more than that. In some cases, I think a person really needs sympathy. So for example, let's say someone just went through a death, and you give them sympathy. Well, in that state, they may need some extra energy. So when you give them the sympathy, it actually helps to buck them up. But what happens in a lot of cases, and if you guys notice, is that people become addicted to sympathy. And this, in all the years I've been doing this, is dangerous. Because when a person is addicted to sympathy, it inhibits growth. And that's when true compassion is needed. Now I'm going to tell you a story that it's not the kindest story in the world, but it was the moment in my life I realized there was a difference between compassion and sympathy, and I didn't realize I realized it at the time. I was very young. I was in my early 20s, and I had a friend whom I was very close to. She and I spent a lot of time together, and all the time. And she had a habit of, and I'm not criticizing. Please, I'm not criticizing this, but she had a habit of going out with men who were really not great for her. And again, I'm not criticizing. None of us had it figured out back then by any means. But in one particular case, she got involved with an individual who was really, really, really not great. He was not a great individual. He belittled her. He talked down to her. He dominated her and took her power. And I'd seen her go through this with men time and again, and she got to the point where she was saying all the time, she didn't want this to happen, she didn't want this to happen, she didn't want to happen this anymore. So here's what happened. It got to the point where she asked me what I thought, and I said, well, he doesn't really treat you very well. He doesn't really treat you very well, and you're always doubting yourself when you're around this person, and you're always calling me to tell me all the horrible things he's done. And I'm like, is this really what you want out of a relationship? Now, this became a daily thing where she'd call me and she'd talk about this guy for like an hour. She'd like be feeding on the sympathy I would give her. I was like, I know, it's really bad. You deserve more. You're so much better. There's so much more to you. You're a beautiful woman. And she was a very beautiful woman. And she had a strong presence when she wanted, but when she was around one of these guys, she looked old and she looked feeble. And I didn't realize it back then, but these men were actually feeding on her. So she actually looked old, she looked feeble, and she lost her nerve. But when she was alone and she wasn't with these guys, she came up and she became more optimistic, and she had more power. But every day she would call me, and then I'd be like telling her, oh my God, you got all these things going for you, and she'd be feeding on it more and more. And the tension was on her, the attention was on her. And then she'd go back to him the next day, and the next day it would be something else, and she'd call me something else. Well, at this time, I was trying to get into graduate school, and I had a lot on my plate, and there was a lot going on, and I had a deadline, and I had to get stuff in. And I noticed that I was spending lots of time shoring her up about this, and I realized something. The fact that I was feeding her was giving her the energy replacement that he was sucking off of her. So he was sucking the energy off of her, and then she'd go for me, and it would take me an hour to like give my energy to her to buck her up, and then she'd have the energy to go back to him that he'd feed on. And I realized this is what's going on. And I realized that the more that I talked to her, encouraged her, and said, oh my God, you're so beautiful, you don't need this, the more that was becoming the excuse that she needed to continue to go with him. So I did something very hard. She called me the next day, and I had been warning her that I felt like it was going to escalate and it was going to get worse, that it wasn't going to get better. The next day she called me, and she said, he hit me. And I said, I'm busy, I can't talk now. And I hung up the phone. 3 or 4 days later, I got a phone call from her to say that she had left him. And the funny thing is that she was using this phone call to tell me that she didn't think I was a great friend, that I really didn't support her, and that was the end of our friendship. But the funny thing was I realized that when I was doing this, I wasn't really being a good friend. I was supporting all of that and helping her indulge it, and I was feeding her my energy so that she could continue to go into a situation where, if that's what she wanted, that was great. But that didn't necessarily mean that had to be my reality. And at the time, I was really interested in going in more positive directions in my life, and not really, So sympathy, indulging in the attention that you get from someone else who's saying, oh, it's okay, poor you. Now, like I said, there's sometimes when sympathy is really appropriate. Someone loses a pet. I mean, it's horrible. Someone loses a family member. Someone goes through a bad breakup. I get it. But there comes a point when the person has to get off the life support. And in those cases where someone's actually coming to you and invoking help, compassion is a very different thing. For my friend, me not being there deprived her of the energy that she needed to keep giving to him, and she had to make the decision. Do I want this, or do I want me? And she chose her. And in the end, she didn't appreciate that I'd realized that and made that decision to really help her, and she cut me out of her life, which was okay, because I learned something at that moment. was really important. That there were people who wanted sympathy, and then there's people who want compassion. Compassion is the ability to help someone to actually cut the things that are keeping them low, cut the things that are keeping them from their power. And those sometimes seem rather harsh, and sometimes they seem rather unpleasant. And sometimes they come disguised as the devil. And for those of you who haven't seen that video I did on the devil, watch the video I did on the devil, because that's actually playing into this as well. Sometimes they are very sensitive. Sometimes it is very sensitive. Sometimes it is very caring. Sometimes it isn't. And for her, this looked very harsh. But I realized that I was doing her harm by continually giving her the attention and shoring up her ego. And I don't mean that modern new age term that everyone throws around, ego. It was she had no confidence in herself, and I was supplying it. And meanwhile, she would give it to hit this guy, and it would, this way she had to actually stand up for herself. But the irony was she turned against the one person who knew it. And she said, well, you're not a real friend. Well, her other friends were all telling her to stay with the guy. And I said, you know what? I was the only friend who really did care about what happened to you. So remember, there's a difference between sympathy and compassion. Sympathy is when a parent sees a child throwing a tantrum and they give in. And they go, oh, well, he wants this, I'm going to give it to him. Compassion is the individual that knows that if they continually give in to those tantrums that the child is having, then something really bad happens when the child is an adult. That child will not be able to interact with other adults in an adult way because they will have learned tantrum is how they get things done. Now you've got a world full of people who are running around having to deal with that adult throwing temper tantrums and wanting to be the center of attention and exploding. And instead of the parent seeing the child doing it and going, no, this is going to lead to a very difficult upbringing where no one will want to be around them. They will have difficulty in their relationships, and they won't be able to be actualized themselves. That's the difference between sympathy and compassion. Sympathy says, oh wow, I see the child suffering because he or she wants this. I'm going to give it to them. That's dangerous. Compassion is recognizing this child has to grow into an adult that is completely functional and can take care of him or herself. But here's where it goes wrong. Sympathy can be used as a way to dominate and control people. You will see this all the time. People will wait until someone has a bad thing happen, and then they'll start plying them with attention and sympathy. Sympathy, and then they'll start to manipulate the person. Now that's a whole other video, and I could go into that deeply, but that's really where sympathy gets really dangerous, is when the other person tries to use sympathy to put another person beneath them. Because sympathy says, I've got more power, I've got more energy, I've got more whatever than you, I'm putting you beneath me. I'm the one to tell you you're beautiful. I'm the one to tell you, oh, you're fine, you're good, you're what. I'm taking advantage of that situation that you're in a low position to show my control over you. And then, and I know you guys have seen that, what happens is those people sometimes use sympathy in their world to manipulate other people and get what they want and dominate people. And then, when the other person doesn't do what they want, they start to get mean, vicious, vindictive, and manipulative to put the person in a situation where they fail again, and then they can start to apply sympathy on them again. That happens a lot in relationships, and it happens a lot between parents and children, and it happens a lot between friends. So love relationships happens in friendships, and it happens in parent and child relationships, both sides, children to parents and parents to children. So the next time you want sympathy, ask yourself, is sympathy really the thing I want? Is that really the food I need? Do I really need this much attention? Do I need someone else telling me how great I am? Or can I do that on my own? Or do I need compassion, where someone or something actually shows me how to cut those things that keep me bound, that keep me stuck, that keep me suffering? Because sometimes those things aren't very pleasant and they're not very easy. But in the long run, the individual who is the recipient of true compassion ends up really grateful. I like to think somewhere along the way that friend of mine one day woke up and said, you know, that was really cool. He knew that I was being abused. He knew that something bad was coming. And by not indulging it, I walked away from something where someone was actually starting to get physically violent. I'm Lucky Lynx, as always, wishing you success and good fortune in all that you do. Hey, if you'd like to get a reading from me, 779-302-8009 is the way to do it, or conjurehope@gmail.com. And if you would like to learn how to read the tarot cards in a way that introduces them in a basic class to the storytelling aspect and how your life is a story, contact me. I'll show you how to get in that class that I've got going right now. Also, I got an intermediate to advanced class you could be part of. I've also got a Mexican Loteria class, a crystal ball reading class, a playing card reading class, a Lenormand Basic, and a Lenormand Grand Tableau class. I've got all of these classes if you'd like to take them, and you will be better than when you started. If you are interested in Tibetan Bon, I have been talking about this nonstop on this channel. My master, His Holiness Padma Gampo Rinpoche, is doing a retreat here in Northern California. It's like a week away now. Last chance. People are coming from all over the country to do this, and 3 empowerments. Ikazati, the mother of manifestation, Lion-Faced Dakini, the Dakini of protection and of removing negativity from your life, and Vajrakalaya, who destroys and breaks through all obstacles. If you're interested in getting involved in this retreat, being a part of this retreat, I do know His Holiness too. If you're in the Northern California area, I do know that he is giving a discount to people who want to cook for the retreat and help out like that. So if you're interested in doing something like that, contact me and I'll send you to His Holiness and you can talk to him about it. And for those of you who have donated, I am very grateful for all the donations. I really appreciate it. And if you would like to donate because you like these videos and you want to help keep them coming, I will put my Venmo and my PayPal below. Remember, sympathy